You're listening to episode 158 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness researchers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Irene Kraegel joins us to speak about the mindful Christian. If you're listening to this podcast and find value and insights from what is shared here, know that this can only be sustained with your generosity. Please take a moment, go to presentmomentmindfulness.com and click on Make a Donation if you value these conversations, which can't continue without your contributions. Thank you for your help and your support. I often hear concerns from people that mindfulness is in conflict with their religious views. Most of the time, there's an opportunity to clear up those misunderstandings, but there remains a strong bias about mindfulness just being stealth Buddhism. Spoiler alert, it's not. And today's guest will add an insider's perspective on how mindfulness is also for people of other faith traditions. Irene Kraegel is a clinical psychologist in Grand Rapids, Michigan. She's worked in community mental health and then in private practice before joining Calvin University's Center for Counseling and Wellness in 2009, first as a counselor and now serving as director. She's known for writing and resources at her website, The Mindful Christian. Our guest today is Irene Kraegel. Irene, nice to meet you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So I've really been looking forward to this conversation since we connected on email, and I'm really looking forward to unpacking this topic with you. But let's start by just having you tell us a bit about your background.
Sure. My professional background is as a psychologist. So I was trained at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, and I've worked as a clinical psychologist since about 2003. And I've been in a few different kinds of clinical settings, and most recently have been at Calvin University, where I work at the Center for Counseling and Wellness, which is a student counseling center there at Calvin. And that work has really been what's brought me to mindfulness, which is why I'm here today. But yeah, professionally, mostly the mental health field. And I have also been in the world of Christian faith my whole life as well. And again, that's been my more recent professional interest, is melding psychology and mindfulness in with a Christian worldview. So I'm sure I could say much more about myself, but I'll leave it at that for now.
That's a good start to our conversation, and I want to go into a little bit of that and how you got interested in mindfulness. You mentioned that was a little bit part of what you've been doing the past several years. So how did that first come about? How did that show up?
It first came up because I was hearing about it everywhere. So in the field of mental health, it was the hot topic, but it was a hot topic that didn't seem to be going away. It just kept popping up. And as I heard about it, it was starting to sound like an approach to mental well-being and mental health that had some depth to it, and I liked that. There's a lot in mental health that's very effective, but is focused on maybe efficiency and tips about managing different challenges and things that can be very helpful. But as I applied those in my own life, I didn't always feel like they had the kind of lasting impact that I wanted personally, and I didn't always feel comfortable recommending those as the only thing for my clients as well. So when I heard about mindfulness, it sounded like something that could really have a lot to offer for my clients who are struggling with anxiety, depression, all kinds of emotional suffering. And it was also a point in my own life where I was experiencing some emotional suffering myself, coming to grips with some depression that had really been there my whole life, but that wasn't really resolving or healing in the way I would like it to, despite a lot of other very positive coping skills I was using and different approaches I had taken. I felt like I was really longing for something deeper. So it was a professional interest, it was a personal interest. And having gone to a few trainings that were really connected to the world of mental health, I decided I wanted to go through the mindfulness based stress reduction training. Um, not as a teacher, as a student, and
Thank you
have
for
that.
that.
Yeah, just to
So many
clarify.
people say they take the class because I want to be a teacher. I'm like, have you taken the class? No. Then how do you know you want to teach it? So thank you for taking it
Yes,
for you.
yes, yes. It's phenomenal. It's such a great class. And I found that within really the first 1 to 2 sessions of MBSR, I was personally experiencing some really deep transformation. So people in the world of science talk about these brain shifts and physical changes that happen when we experience mindfulness meditation. I felt that in my brain within the first couple of weeks, that I was thinking differently, I was feeling differently, and it was giving me a whole new set of tools to manage emotional difficulties. So I very quickly became a believer. And from that point on, I got pretty excited then about bringing it to students I was working with at Calvin University. Um, and in that context, making sure that I was blending it with the Christian faith that's important to the university as well. So that was kind of what initially drew me to it, and that was about 7 years ago or so.
And it's interesting as you were mentioning having some hesitancy around some of the techniques and tips and tricks for patients who are suffering. It just, the image came to mind of bailing out a boat, and that's just constantly springing these leaks. And wouldn't it be great if there was a way that you could maybe build a boat that wasn't going to spring leaks, or maybe not quite as many? And this, to me, is one of the values of practices like mindfulness, and not the only one. There are others as well, but ways in which we can build up our resiliency, our ability to work with challenging circumstances, to really soak in the positive times as well, not just about the negative ones and how do we deal with that, but also really being present for the joys in our life as well. So thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, and one of the phrases I find myself using is that mindfulness was a gift that helped me unlock the other gifts. So it wasn't that those other things weren't also useful. I find myself drawing pretty heavily on cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, for myself and others, noticing how thought patterns can be distorted, noticing alternative thoughts that I might engage with. There's a lot of really good concrete CBT out there and other similar approaches. And we have things like exercise that we know are really good for our mental health and social connection, and good eating habits. I mean, the list goes on and on of the things that are good for us. But somehow it was mindfulness that allowed me to access the benefits of those. So something like CBT in the past, I might have engaged with those exercises and some of that work and just found that it locked me into a power struggle in my head. So I might work at identifying a maladaptive thought pattern. But before I knew it, I was just in this argument with myself about whether that was really maladaptive or not. So mindfulness has given me a new tool to step out of that power struggle in my head and receive all those other benefits as well. Now I can notice those thoughts, but without so much gripping onto them and struggling with them. Same for exercise, same for relationships. I can enjoy social interaction much more now that I have that tool of mindfulness. that allows me to kind of watch my thoughts, watch my feelings, let them go by. So I continue to practice and
Mhm.
preach all of the mental health tools out there. And I find for me, I needed mindfulness to really be able to benefit from them.
Yeah, it's fascinating that you bring up CBT and getting caught in one's own thoughts. We were just in our in-person mindfulness group on Monday nights going through the cognitive distortions.
Hmm.
And that this is a group I've been working with for several years, and there's we get 20, 30 some people, and they're grounded in mindfulness, and how their approach to this, their observations of these distortions as they show up, was really interesting and maybe a little bit different than others who might not have that firm foundation of mindfulness to work on. And so I'm kind of
Hmm.
curious in your own practice if you've run into working with students or patients or even others just in your daily life on things like cognitive distortions and just our ability to notice them if that's been supported by mindfulness.
Hmm. Absolutely. It seems to me that you can't work on it or modify it if you don't know it's there. I know, I mean, to state the obvious, I
Yeah.
suppose, right? Um, so I know for myself, when I first started practicing, it was rather surprising and shocking to me how many judgmental thoughts were streaming through my mind at every moment. I had no idea that was going on. I knew I was maybe a bit cynical and negative, but I didn't realize the extent to which there was kind of a constant barrage of negativity towards myself. Super helpful to notice. Like when I noticed that, it was sort of this, oh, that's so interesting. Like maybe there's another way to relate to myself. And that was, like I said, a really big turning point, very transformational. And that has to be the foundation of good CBT or cognitive behavioral work. If we want to modify those thought patterns, we have to know they're there. It's very perplexing to me how we can have thoughts that we don't know we're having. I mean,
Yeah.
that's sort of a
Yeah.
philosophical puzzle. Like, how can they be thoughts if we're not even conscious we're thinking them? So I'll leave that for a philosopher who's wiser than I on your podcast at some point. But it is true. You know, as I think maybe it's just the speed at which those thoughts are flying by. We're not aware of them unless we really are paying attention. And I thought I was paying attention, but mindfulness let me gain a whole new level of insight into what was happening in the madness of my mind and to kind of tame that a bit. To notice when it was getting noisy and then use some of those cognitive behavioral tools to quiet things down a little bit.
Yeah. And it's interesting the distinction between what thinking is, because growing up, I just identified as my thoughts. That was who I was. And then learning about just being able to shift my focus from somatic experience of the breath or touch or listening or something like that, and also thinking, and like, oh wait, there can be some spaciousness around that and non-identification with the thoughts. So this really transformative power, knowing that I can move attention around and notice what's there. Not a. I often run into the phrase we use, getting some distance from, and to me, it's not a getting a distance from. It's a moving closer to, making it bigger and being able to
Mm,
see it a little bit more closely.
yeah. Yeah, and I think learning to recognize thoughts as the experience. So as you're talking there, you're differentiating those thoughts from physical sensations and other parts of experience, and that I think is an incredibly useful part of mindfulness. There's sometimes when I try to summarize the benefit of mindfulness, I talk about this understanding that thoughts are not the only way to see the world, and that in itself was really different for me to realize there's a different way of being in the world besides thinking about it. I was raised in a household that was very philosophical and language based, so everything was analyzed and thought about. And I didn't really have any other way of being besides analyzing and thinking about everything. And so I obviously see great benefit in continuing to think well, and to make sure that thoughts are true and helpful and all of that. And it's been really liberating to see that I can learn to relate to my experience in the world more directly than through interpretations and analysis and thoughts. So that's been really liberating for me.
Wonderful. Now, it's so fascinating to me that in the time we've been talking here about the past 10 minutes or so, really this is the same kind of conversation I would have had with any other guest on mindfulness. And our topic today that we're going to dive into is your book, The Mindful Christian, Cultivating a Life of Intentionality, Openness, and Faith. And for some listening, that might seem a little surprising. There may be a particular view about what mindfulness is that might not necessarily be wrong in some contexts, but part of today's episode, and specifically what I'm looking forward to in speaking with you, Irene, is this broadening of what mindfulness can be for other people. That doesn't have to be just one thing. So I want to hear about your journey with mindfulness and your faith and the book. What made you decide to put the book together?
Yeah, the book really was born out of a website. So I've been writing for quite a few years at themindfulchristian.com about ideas related to this integration of mindfulness and Christian faith. That was initially inspired really by my own personal journey. I have always been very committed to my Christian faith, so I see God very much at the center of who I am and how I understand the world. That really forms my worldview. So as I had initially heard about mindfulness, I really was hearing about it primarily from a Buddhist perspective, and it was being named oftentimes as a Buddhist practice. And while there are many Christians who feel that they can blend Christianity and Buddhism, and I respect that point of view as well, I find that there is a lot of difference in the two worldviews. And while it's nice to say we can all, that there's no real difference, I think that's just not quite the case. And so, so for me to have integrity about the practice, I needed to understand that it could fit with my Christian faith. And so I entered into sort of a personal journey as I went into a mindfulness class to understand how could this fit theologically with what I believe. And then as I was taking the class then, entering into MBSR, it very quickly on a personal level became clear to me that there was no problem here. So as I was learning mindfulness, and I will say my mindfulness teacher was very secular in her presentation of it. So I think that helped. I always appreciate it.
Which it should be with MBSR. It is a secular program.
Exactly. And one thing that I find is that there are people who teach MBSR with that very secular slant. And then there are others who maybe technically do, but maybe all of their quotes that they write on the board or all the examples they give are all referring to Buddhist texts or resources, and they may not quite understand or be aware of that bias or that slant they're putting on it. And understandably so, if that's the position that they are coming from personally. So I was fortunate to work with somebody that really was able to present it without a lot of that slant to it, and made it very accessible in some ways. So as I was learning the practice, what I was finding is that it was a spiritual experience for me. And so having been somebody who's practiced a lot of spiritual disciplines in different ways over the years, this practice of getting quiet and paying attention for me became a connection to the presence of God, is how I was experiencing it. That there was no barrier. It was more of a conduit to a spiritual experience for me. And so kind of combining with some of that reading and research I had done, along with that personal experience, made it clear to me that they could coexist. And so there was that personal journey, but then the other reason that I was so interested in writing about it and talking about it was because of what you mentioned before, which is there is kind of a perception that they can't go together. And I know when I started doing Google searches of mindfulness and Christianity, I was a bit horrified at what was popping up. Right? So Christians were freaking out about this practice and saying, if you get quiet, the devil's going to come in, or, we can't let ourselves be overtaken by this societal madness or whatever it was. Things that really were not at all based in truth or reality. So a lot of fear out there. And then people in the mindfulness world, skeptical of Christianity as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I sort of thought, this doesn't need to be this way. And I've had a passion just for injecting something online that would certainly allow Christians to be more open to the practice of mindfulness. And so it was really out of that work over time and blogging about it and writing about it, also teaching it on a Christian campus. It was out of that work that my book was born.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been a journey.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And there's so much richness there that I want to explore further. One of the things that you mentioned that is very timely in my conversations I've had online, I was recently tagged in a post on Facebook about a research paper in a scientific journal. I want to be clear, folks who are listening to this, scientific journal, not a Buddhist journal, scientific journal. And I was asked to take a look at it, and of course immediately found it slanted, just as you were describing, Irene, towards Buddhism. And one of the authors was on that post and said, "Oh, what do you mean?" Like, well, you start by describing this as mindfulness must start with samasati, which is a Pali term which has no place in a scientific journal, and immediately shows that you're biased towards this being a particular thing. Oh, we just mention it there. But wait, there's more. And it goes on to describe non-Buddhist mindfulness. This is just in the first few pages of this paper. These are quotes: deeply a narcissistic enterprise, charlatanism. And I just had a journal, like I know this is 67 some pages long. I'm done with the first 5. There's nothing in here that is not biased, and there's no point in me continuing. Wow. So I see that one side of it. Well, it's got to be Buddhist, and I see this unfortunate trend in many mindfulness teachers as well, teaching secular programs, who, when they get to the underpinnings, stop at a layer of Buddhism. Mm-hmm. And as someone who's I'm well known in Buddhist circles, this is something that I do and have taught in context for over 20 years. I know it fairly well. This is a different thing. We're doing a program like MBSR, for example. And that what has always appealed to me about Buddhist tradition is not the Buddhism part. It's that it is a reflection of my experience in real life. When you get to the, what do we see in what I notice about things change, and stuff I don't like happens. And I get bunched up about that because of my relationship to it. And how can I change that? Mm-hmm. So it's underpinnings of the underpinnings. And I see so few people getting to that point. Mm-hmm. So I really appreciate that perspective that you're bringing up, because I see the same thing. I think there is a very strong bias that people are unable to see. Mm-hmm. And then on the critiques that I've seen and been targeted by from some Christian, I was part of a panel discussion on meditation many years ago at a Christian university in Minnesota. Mm-hmm. And one of the other presenters from that school said, my friend they tried meditation and they were just all messed up and they couldn't walk, and we had to get them, flown out of wherever they were. And like, well, hang on just a second. You mentioned that they were a heavy drug user at that time. I'm going to go out on a limb and say maybe meditation wasn't the culprit. Maybe it was because they were using psychoactive drugs. Do you think that might have been a factor there?
Right. Seems reasonable.
Yeah, it seems reasonable. But that exact thing that you said about, if we get quiet and still our mind, that's where the devil gets in. That was a review response from a Christian radio personality about my participation in this is like that, they sound so good, and that's where the devil gets in. I'm like, what I didn't understand and still don't understand is, how does becoming more aware of what's happening in your internal experience, your mind, your heart, your body, around your external experience, wouldn't that be being a little bit more sensitized to things coming up that you don't want to have inside as intrusive? So I want to hear more about what your conversations may have been like with other Christians about this, and what you found in some of their attitudes about it.
Yeah. Well, to answer that question, I've been delightfully surprised that I've had almost no pushback, knock on wood, in terms of presenting. Now that I have a book out as of this week, maybe that'll change. I'm ready to be targeted. But I initially, when I prepared to teach this at a Christian university, one of the reasons I did so much work is to make sure that I was prepared for some fire. There's been none. There have been no complaints at all. I think I've had one parent email me to say, I see you have meditation that you're offering at your counseling center. Is that transcendental, meditation? And, just having some questions.
Yeah.
Really, I think when it's presented in the context of a Christian practice, then Christians tend to be open to it. I sometimes get questions clarifying. So for example, at an event last night I was speaking at, somebody raised their hand and said, so sometimes you're saying mindfulness practice and sometimes you're saying mindfulness meditation. What's the difference? And part of what I heard in her question was, I'm not sure about the meditation thing, right? Like, is that safe? And I find it is a little funny, because meditation is so deeply rooted in the Christian tradition. Christianity is full of meditative practices and has been since the beginning. And with many of these things, my lens that I see this through is really one of culture. So I think that we have developed any kind of faith practice, and really any kind of practice, any kind of life is embedded in culture. We can't get away from that. And so in this particular time and place in history, at least where I'm located at this point, I think there's not a lot of verbal naming of contemplative practices within Christian faith, or maybe in general in society. And so, Western culture is fairly individualistic and fairly hardworking and busy and driven. And we don't often place a lot of value on things like sitting in silence and being aware. And so when I can come to the conversation about mindfulness and Christianity, thinking about it through a cultural lens, that can help tear down some of those walls too. Some of it is just literally the language we use. So I often think about myself as a translator for people in the Christian world who might hear things from the mindfulness world, and there are a lot of trigger words that somebody who's not within the Christian subculture would even be aware of. An example that always comes to my mind early on when I was learning about mindfulness, there was somebody who was speaking to a group of Christians who was not herself from a Christian tradition. And she was talking about this beautiful phrase, I believe from Buddhism, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea that you cannot wash blood away with blood, and you cannot wash thoughts away with thoughts. So I don't know if I got that exactly right. But the idea that she was talking about washing blood away, that's a phrase in Christianity, right?
Yeah,
like
that's a thing.
That's a thing. As weird as it might sound, that's a thing. We talk a lot about, the blood of Christ, the blood of Jesus washing away our sins. This is very foundational to Christianity. So even a phrase like that, which is actually quite helpful for me to think, oh, I can't use my thoughts to wash away my thoughts, just like you can't use blood to wash away blood. But that was a point where some interpretation might have been helpful, right? Some cultural interpretation. And I wasn't in the room when she said that, but my understanding is the response was sort of a lot of whispering,
Hmm.
right? Like, and I can imagine people being like, oh, that Jesus' blood does wash things away. So I think there are phrases like that where sometimes if somebody is within that Christian subculture, for better or worse, it allows some translation to happen. It allows some access. Um, so in my experiences, as long as I'm able to present it in a way that isn't using those kinds of trigger phrases, that gives a little extra explanation around things that might cause some anxiety for folks.
Hmm.
I feel like as long as I'm kind of listening out for any concerns people might have and addressing those, yeah, for the most part, it's been very well received, which is encouraging to me that there hasn't really been a lot of pushback. And one or two things online, I mean, online is, but really literally one or two things.
Yeah.
So not a big concern.
So it's so interesting that phrasing can really have such an impact on
Yeah.
how we see things. And what I have found particularly interesting on your site is the very elegant way in which you describe what mindfulness is. And you're targeting that for a Christian audience. And your base description of what mindfulness is about being a person. And you tie in your faith later on as to how this connects in. And one of the things that uh, I, as someone who is not Christian, find very rewarding is that if at the end of one of my classes, someone who is from Christian or some other faith entirely says, "This, I really feel closer to my beliefs now. I'm more aware of them. I feel more connected to them, and I couldn't be happier because this is what is most meaningful to them."
Mhm.
And they're closer to that, and that's wonderful. And I'm wondering if in your work you're seeing this bringing people in the Christian faith closer to their beliefs and their faith.
Mhm. Yeah, I think often that's the case. When I teach mindfulness, and I'm not MBSR trained, but I do present mindfulness in a group class format to students. Um, and so, in the process of those 7 weeks that we spend together in that class, my approach is definitely not to make it preachy. So I'm focused on presenting mindfulness as a tool. I offer some tidbits along the way about how it can integrate with Christian faith. There's lots in scripture and lots in Christian writing in general that lends itself to blending the two. So my goal is to present that, and students can do with that as they wish. So some students come in with really strong Christian faith, some with no faith, some somewhere in the middle, maybe not sure. Um, and I find that the responses are all over the board in terms of the importance of the faith in the mindfulness journey. One of the things I found helpful is to give students options um, in terms of how much they would like to explicitly name God in their mindfulness practices. I know there's I've heard it said before by somebody outside of the Christian tradition that centering prayer is different than mindfulness. And I do agree with that in some ways. The area I disagree with that is that I think that from a Christian worldview, God is always part of the present moment. So when we choose in the present moment to focus our awareness and our attention on God, um, that's not pulling us away from the present moment. That is, we've chosen God as the object of our attention,
Right.
just like we might choose the breath or the things we see in the room or the feeling on the bottom of our feet, right? We've chosen.
Or to Buddhists who are listening to Dhamma's phenomenon, the fourth of the traditional Satipatthana.
Yeah. So really, recognizing that worldview is going to impact what's available to us or where we're focusing in that moment. So something like centering prayer, which is a practice of being quiet for about 20 minutes, sitting in silence, bringing our attention back over and over and over to God's presence in that moment. Whenever we notice our attention has wandered away, we bring it back to God's presence in that moment. Sometimes for centering prayer, people even use their breath as a cue, or they'll call it a symbol of God's presence in the moment. And so to me, that's a Christian practice that has incredible overlap with mindfulness. I really think we could call that mindfulness, just choosing God as the focus of attention. So for some Christian practitioners, they are really longing for those practices that very explicitly name God. And I also do a variation of a loving kindness practice that names God very explicitly. The beauty of loving kindness practice is that it's so wide open. I mean, there are many options for the phrasing we can use and the words we can use. I found that as a Christian, loving kindness practice was the hardest for me to warm up to. So again, I think because it has more language, the language doesn't quite fit with the way that Christians often would pray. So it's just different words. And initially it just sort of felt wrong to me. And
it feels wrong to me, actually, too. The way I typically hear loving kindness given is and frankly, a very Buddhist way, which in a secular program, I'm not at all comfortable with. And so I will often do another kind, it's still loving kindness meditation. You're still bringing in and evoking this felt sense of care, compassion, and others. And it doesn't have to be a particular recitation. So I always give people options in that guidance that are different than that, because it does open it up to meet people where they are.
That's nice. Yeah. And just giving those options, we know, I think we're becoming more and more aware as the field of mindfulness that options are so important anyway with mindfulness. So we're finding this with trauma work, right? That
exactly.
Focusing on the breath can be incredibly distressing, and overwhelming and flooding for many people. That when you think of the number of individuals going through mindfulness programs who we can assume have experienced significant trauma, just based on national statistics.
About 17% from my last conversation with David 11 about this. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So, that we're finding that we need to be aware as we speak that wherever we're asking people to focus could potentially be quite triggering and difficult for them. So one of my shifts that I've made over the past couple of years is just to more intentionally sprinkle every meditation with "if you choose," right? So focus your attention here if you choose. And to, whenever it's appropriate, just offer a couple options. You're welcome to close your eyes or leave them open, or you're welcome to lay down or sit up, or those types of things. And so having said that, I think in bringing that into loving kindness meditation is very nice. The way that I've framed that in the group that I lead is to offer a version of it that really sounds like a Christian blessing. So here's Christian language, right? We would call it a blessing. And so we practice phrases like, may you know God's love, may you know God's joy, may you know God's rest, may you know God's peace. And saying those phrases, kind of being clear that when we talk about knowing, we're not talking about thinking. We're talking about really what we sometimes call a biblical knowing. So in the Bible, sometimes to know is a way of expressing sort of intimacy, right, or depth. So we talk about knowing as kind of an experience of our full being, not just our thinking being. And so when we talk about knowing God's love and joy and rest and peace, it's really a way of resting in those qualities. And we practice with each of the groups, so ourselves and somebody we love and the stranger, et cetera, et cetera. We practice imagining each of those people in God's hand, just resting there in God's loving hands. So some love that meditation, right? We end and they say, oh, I felt so close to God and it helped me forgive this difficult person that we were thinking about. And it brought me closer to a sense of God loving me when I imagined myself in God's loving hands. And so for some, that's what they hold on to, and they choose to practice that every day. Others say, oh man, that brought up all kinds of religious conflict in my head, right? Or they might say, I've been struggling with my faith and I'm not quite sure what I think about all that. And so it's one of those things where, we sometimes talk about trusting in the sovereignty of God. So as I trust in God's sovereignty, all I need to do is set it out there, and then people can choose, right? Which of those is more helpful for them? And for some people, they find that these practices really are deepening their religious faith. For some, they're finding that it's bringing some emotional and mental wellness that maybe is almost a prerequisite for them before they can even figure out where they are in terms of their own faith or religious journey. I think that the religious faith it's very complicated, right? It's very, when I think of how complicated relationships in general are, and then I think of what is it like for us to work out some sense of a relationship with the divine, that's huge. And so I think part of the beauty of mindfulness is that it's a tool that can be used in a purely secular form and have great benefit, and it can be used combined with a whole variety of faith traditions. That's why it shows up in just about every major world religion throughout history, this idea of present moment awareness in some way, shape, or form. And then it can take on a whole other level of depth when it's combined that way, but it doesn't need to be. And it might sound a little mundane, but sometimes if I sense there might be resistance, I even just talk about all the other many tools we have that are good for us, whether we combine them with religion or not. So when I brush my teeth in the morning, I don't sit there and think like, is it okay I'm depending on this toothbrush instead of on God? We just sort of assume that if we're coming at toothbrushing from a religious perspective, from a Christian perspective, we would see that toothbrush as a gift of God. Like, thank you, God, for this toothbrush. Thank you for good dental hygiene. That is really great. And we don't see it as a conflict with our faith. And so as mundane as that sounds, in some ways, that's how I think of mindfulness. This is an amazing tool. And then for people who have a Christian worldview, there's also this option then to receive that tool and practice it in the context of a loving relationship with a divine being who's given life. So what cooler thing to do than to really pay attention to this gift of life that's been given to us.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. So for those who are listening, if you'd like to find out more, we're going to have a link to Irene's website, themindfulchristian.com, and we'll also have a link to her book on the episode page, so check that out as well. Our guest today, Irene Kraegel, thank you so much for being here. Really enjoyed our conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a delight.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come and visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.